The house stood at the edge of the forgotten road like a sentinel abandoned by time, its tall frame bending slightly as though the earth itself had grown weary of holding it upright. Its windows were blind, dark panes of glass that seemed less like openings and more like eyes sealed shut in grief. The roof sagged in places where decades of storms had pressed too heavily, and ivy wound itself along the stone walls, clinging tightly as if to keep the house from falling apart. Yet despite its decay, it did not feel lifeless. If anything, the structure seemed to be waiting, patient and heavy with expectation, as though it had always known someone would come back. The moment I stepped off the gravel road and onto the cracked pathway, the air shifted. It was not just the cold that pressed against me, though it was sharp enough to sting my skin. It was the weight of silence, a silence so thick it made the distant rustle of trees sound unnaturally loud. My footsteps rang against the broken stone like intrusions, as though each sound carried deeper into the house than the walls themselves allowed. The place was empty, yet I felt as though every corner, every window, every space of shadow already knew I was there. The wooden door loomed ahead, swollen with age, its once rich color dulled to a lifeless gray. Carvings lined its surface, patterns almost erased by time, though certain shapes still lingered, circles, spirals, marks too deliberate to be dismissed as mere decoration. I traced a hand over them, and for a fleeting moment the wood pulsed faintly warm, as though some echo of the house itself acknowledged my touch. My chest tightened, a warning to step back, but curiosity pulled me forward. The door resisted at first, groaning against its rusted hinges, before giving way with a low sigh, as though it had been waiting too long for someone to open it. The air inside was stale, heavy with dust, yet not entirely dead. A faint current brushed past me as I crossed the threshold, not like a breeze but like the breath of something vast and unseen. The interior revealed itself slowly, my torchlight dragging over warped floorboards, peeling wallpaper, and corridors that stretched unnaturally long, darker than they had any right to be. Furniture stood where it had been abandoned decades before, covered in torn sheets that sagged with dust, but their shapes looked disturbingly human in the dim light, figures frozen in the act of watching me. I paused in the entrance hall, trying to listen. At first there was only the ringing quiet, the muffled beat of my own heart echoing in my ears. But then, faintly, from deep within the house, came a sound. Not footsteps, not movement, but something far subtler. A creak like a door slowly shifting, or wood breathing under pressure. It was enough to remind me that the silence was not empty at all. It was alive, and it was listening. My torch caught a staircase rising into the gloom, its banister warped and cracked. Dust floated lazily in the beam of light, disturbed only by my breath. For a long moment I stood frozen, debating whether to venture further. Yet I had not come here to stop at the door. I had come here because this house was said to be haunted, because whispers claimed voices still drifted through its rooms long after its last occupants had vanished. I had come not just to listen but to speak, to reach into the dark and see if anything reached back. The floor groaned beneath my weight as I moved deeper, each step echoing louder than the last. My torch flickered once, dimmed, then steadied again, as though something unseen had brushed against the light. The air grew thicker, pressing down on my chest with invisible hands. I tried to steady my breathing, but every exhale seemed to vanish too quickly into the space, as though the house swallowed it whole. At the far end of the hall, my light revealed a door half open, tilted slightly from its frame. A darkness thicker than the surrounding gloom pooled within, black and consuming, a void that refused to be pierced by the beam of my torch. My pulse quickened, dread clawing at me, but I knew with absolute certainty that I would have to enter. The silence deepened as I approached, until even the sound of my footsteps seemed stolen. My hand reached for the door, my fingertips brushing the splintered wood. The moment I touched it, the faint hum of the house seemed to change. It was no longer a stillness. It was anticipation. And then, from somewhere just beyond the door, came the faintest whisper, soft, drawn out, and almost human. Spoke my name. The sound of my name lingered in the air like a trace of smoke, impossible to grasp yet impossible to dismiss. I froze in place, my fingers still pressed against the splintered doorframe, my pulse hammering so violently I thought the silence would shatter under its weight. My torchlight trembled against the wall as my grip faltered, the beam dancing across the peeling wallpaper until it landed once more on the black hollow of the room beyond. Nothing moved within. Yet the whisper remained with me, echoing in the folds of my mind, repeated as if my own thoughts had betrayed me. Summoning every scrap of courage, I pushed the door open. The hinges protested with a groan so deep it vibrated through my bones. The darkness inside spilled outward like a tide, swallowing the torchlight until the glow seemed to shrink in my hand. I stepped across the threshold, and immediately the air thickened. It was not simply cold, but damp, as though the room itself exhaled against me. Dust stirred at my arrival, but it did not float idly. It moved in waves as if stirred by breath, steady in and out, in and out. The realization settled into my chest with a weight I could not shake. The room was not still. It was breathing. My light crept slowly over the space. A long table dominated the center, its surface cracked and warped, chairs pushed back in disarray as if abandoned mid-meal. The walls were lined with faded portraits, their colors leached by time, but the eyes remained sharp, their gaze unervingly direct. Each face seemed to follow my movements, their expressions neither welcoming nor hostile, but endlessly watchful. The sound of breathing deepened, though no one was there. My own breaths came shallow, ragged, as though the room was trying to match me, to pull me into its rhythm. For a fleeting moment, I felt as though something unseen pressed close to my back, inhaling when I exhaled, exhaling when I inhaled, sinking itself with me until I could no longer be sure which breath was mine. My torch wavered and caught on something in the far corner. A mirror stood propped against the wall, its glass fractured with a spider's web of cracks. The surface reflected the dim glow back at me, but in its broken lines my figure did not quite match. My movements were slightly delayed, the tilt of my head a fraction off, my hand lingering a moment longer in the reflection than in reality. I stepped closer, heart clawing at my ribs. The reflection's eyes glittered faintly, not with light but with something alive, watching me from within the fractured glass. I lifted my hand, and so did it, though slower, deliberate, as though testing the limits of its prison. Behind me, the chairs scraped against the floor. I spun, the beam of my torch slicing through the dark, but nothing moved. The table stood as it had before, yet the chairs were not where I had first seen them. They edged closer to the mirror, angled toward it as though something had pulled them into position while I was distracted. The portraits on the walls now seemed to lean forward, their faces stretched unnaturally long in the dimness, their eyes darker, hungrier. The rhythm of breathing thickened until it filled the room, pressing down on my ears like a tide ready to drown me. And then, in the cracked glass of the mirror, my reflection smiled. I had not. The smile in the mirror did not fade. It clung to my reflection like a wound stitched across its face, stretched and unnatural, as if the glass had grown its own intent. My stomach twisted as I stepped back, but the reflection did not retreat. It leaned closer, its head angling forward while mine remained perfectly still. I tore my gaze away, forcing myself not to look into its broken grin, and stumbled out of the room into the corridor beyond. The hallway greeted me with silence once more, though it was not the silence of emptiness. It was watchful, as though the very walls had been waiting for me to return. My torchlight reached down the length of the passage, and the shadows seemed to ripple just beyond its edge, curling like smoke, forming shapes that dissolved before my mind could fully catch them. The house was not abandoned. It was inhabited by something that did not need form or flesh. I pressed onward, my footsteps muffled against the floorboards. Each creak seemed to echo too loudly, carried deeper into the house until the sound did not return. Instead, something else came back. A murmur, low and indistinct, trailing from the far end of the hall. I froze, listening. It grew clearer, though not enough to form words, like a voice caught between speaking and sighing. I followed it. The hall stretched unnaturally, longer than I had first judged, the darkness shifting ahead of me in slow, deliberate swells. Doors lined either side, each closed tightly, their handles glinting faintly in the torchlight. The whisper seemed to weave between them, slipping from one to the next, drawing me further. Halfway down, I stopped. My skin prickled as the sound grew sharper, pressing close to my ear though the corridor was empty. The voice was not inside the rooms. It was in the hall with me. I turned slowly, sweeping the torch across the walls, and for the briefest moment I saw the wallpaper ripple. Not as though stirred by air, but as though something beneath the surface shifted, pressing against it, brushing the paper like skin stretched too thin. My throat tightened as the voice broke through the murmurs, a single sound emerging. It laughed, not loud, not cheerful, but a low, rasping chuckle that scraped along the edges of the silence. It echoed down the hall in both directions, bouncing from the walls until I could not tell where it began. My grip on the torch faltered, and the beam stuttered as my hands trembled. The laughter faded, replaced by breathing once again. But this was different from the room I had left behind. This was heavier, closer, hot against the side of my neck though no one stood there. I spun, light cutting the dark, but the hall was empty. Then a door behind me creaked open on its own. Slowly, deliberately, the whisper poured from within like smoke, curling into my ears, shaping itself into words for the first time. It spoke softly, almost tenderly, yet laced with hunger. I have been waiting. The words clung to the air like cobwebs, each syllable stretching thin yet refusing to break. I have been waiting. The sound had not simply filled the hallway. It had sunk into it, absorbed by the very wood and plaster, as though the house itself had spoken. My torch trembled in my grasp as I stared at the half-open door, its shadow yawning wider with every second, spilling a darkness that felt heavier than any I had faced before. I forced myself forward, each step weighted with reluctance, as if my body understood something my mind refused to accept. The door shifted without my touch, easing open in small jerks, like invisible fingers dragging it wider, revealing a narrow chamber beyond. The air that poured from within was damp, carrying the faint scent of rot and earth, as though the room had been buried alive. Inside, the walls were bare, their plaster fractured into jagged lines, veins of shadow creeping through the cracks. The floor dipped unevenly, boards bending inward as though the ground beneath had sunk. At the center of this warped space stood a chair, simple, wooden, broken in one leg so it tilted slightly to the side. Yet it was not the chair itself that drew my breath short. It was the way sound moved around it. Whispers circled in the room, spiraling close to my ears before darting away again, never fully clear, yet carrying shapes of words that brushed against my understanding. Names, fragments of pleas, sharp bursts of laughter, all folding in and out of one another like a chorus too fractured to unite. The sound did not fade when I covered my ears. It was not heard through the air but through the bones themselves, vibrating in the marrow, stitching itself into the body. I edged closer, my torch trembling as the beam dragged itself over the chair. For a fraction of a moment, I saw something resting upon it. A shape, faint and translucent, bent forward as though weighed by exhaustion. Its head lifted slowly as though straining against centuries, and though its features were blurred by shadow, I knew with certainty that it was looking directly at me. The whispers surged at once, rising to a pitch that rattled the walls. My torchlight flickered violently, the bulb buzzing as though drowning in static. The figure on the chair moved, its form unraveling like smoke, lifting into the air before vanishing entirely. But the sound remained. It sank into the walls, into the floorboards, into the very structure of the house, until it felt as though the building itself was speaking. The whispers united into echoes that pressed close around me, bouncing from every surface yet carrying weight, dragging through my chest like hooks. The voices did not need words anymore. Their message was carved into the tone itself. You are inside us now. The air shuddered. From the ceiling above, dust rained down as though disturbed by unseen hands. The floor beneath me groaned, the dip in the boards deepening. as if something below shifted and clawed its way upward. I stumbled back, the torch beam catching the cracked plaster on the far wall just as it bulged outward, pulsing once like a heartbeat. The echoes rose to a scream, raw, endless, and violent. My torch sputtered, died, and left me in complete darkness. And in that suffocating black, a single voice broke through the chorus, close enough to brush the edge of my ear. It whispered, almost lovingly, "Don't leave." The darkness pressed down with a weight that seemed almost tangible, wrapping itself around me like damp cloth. The whisper, "Don't leave," still lingered in my ear, so close it felt as if lips had grazed my skin. My torch lay useless in my hand, its light extinguished, leaving only the natural black of the house. Yet even in blindness, I knew I was not alone. The air trembled with presence, every breath threaded with something that was not mine. I fumbled at the torch, desperate, shaking it until the beam coughed back into life. The glow was weaker now, pale and stuttering, but enough to carve out fragments of the room. The cracked walls remained, the warped chair still sagged at the center, but something else had shifted. The corners of the chamber were no longer empty. Shadows had gathered there, thick and deliberate, darker than the rest, as if light refused to penetrate. They seemed to pulse faintly, not quite still, rising and receding with the same rhythm as breath. My skin prickled as I realized they were watching, not with eyes, but with awareness. I turned the beam toward the left corner. The shadow shivered, coiling tighter, its edges jagged as though teeth lurked within its form. I swept the light across to the right, and another shadow stretched upward along the wall, tall and crooked, its arms too long, its head bowed as if waiting. The back corner revealed the third, shapeless, fluid, rolling like a mass of ink that had learned to move on its own. They were not still silhouettes cast by objects. They were entities in themselves, and they had been waiting. The whispers returned, but softer now, layered beneath the hum of silence, threading through one another until the words dissolved. Yet their intent was clear. They were summoning me closer, coaxing me into their corners. I stepped back, but the floorboards betrayed me. They groaned loudly, and the sound carried like a signal. The shadows surged in response. The tall one stretched further along the wall, its arm uncoiling as if to reach. The ink-like mass rippled, spilling further across the floor. The jagged one vibrated violently, its shape flickering as though ready to burst. The beam of my torch faltered again, flicking dangerously between light and dark. Each time the glow dimmed, the shadows crept closer, using the lapses to edge toward me. When the light returned, they froze, but not where they had been before. They were advancing, steadily, patient in their hunger. My chest tightened, each breath cutting shorter than the last. I forced my torch toward the doorway, only to find it narrowing. The frame seemed smaller, the edges thickened with darkness, as though the house itself was reshaping to keep me here. The shadows pressed in. They had left their corners now, converging toward the center of the room where I stood. The tall one bent lower, its head almost brushing mine. The ink mass spread beneath my shoes, cold seeping through the soles until it felt as though I were sinking. The jagged one trembled at my side, vibrating faster, like a swarm of unseen insects rattling in its depths. I lifted the torch in one final desperate attempt, the light flaring just enough to catch the mirror I had seen earlier in the hall. Though I had left it behind, its cracked surface glared at me from the far wall of this room now, as if it had followed me here. And in that fractured reflection, I saw not 3 shadows, but dozens, crowded behind me, their hands reaching out, their faces pressed close, every corner of the glass filled with figures that had no place in the world. I spun to face them, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, every figure in it was smiling. Part 6. The question no one should ask. The mirror grinned at me with mouths that did not belong. Row upon row of distorted faces pressed into its cracked glass, their smiles jagged and endless. My throat tightened, my chest heaved, but no scream would come. I tore my gaze away, yet the image burned behind my eyelids, as though the mirror had imprinted its vision onto my mind. I staggered back, torch flickering weakly, the beams slicing across fractured plaster and splintered floorboards. The shadows had receded into the corners once more, but the sense of their presence had only grown heavier, pressing at the edges of my thoughts. It was not simply that they were here, it was that they wanted something. The whispers returned, weaving together like threads drawn into a single rope. This time, they carried words, faint but unmistakable, spoken not from the walls but from within me, vibrating through marrow and blood. Ask. The sound was soft, almost coaxing, but underneath it thrummed a command. My lips trembled, the urge clawing at my tongue, though I did not know the question. The house did. The shadows did. They were waiting, patient, for me to give in. I stumbled toward the door, forcing myself not to obey, but as I crossed the threshold into the hallway, the house shifted again. The corridor bent unnaturally, no longer leading straight, but twisting inwards like a spiral, drawing me deeper whether I wished it or not. Every step carried me closer to the center, as if the building had decided escape would no longer be permitted. The torch beam swung across the walls, catching glimpses of shapes that were not there when I looked again. A pale hand retreating into a crack. A face that dissolved into wallpaper. A shadow that moved against the direction of the light. Each glimpse left a chill that burrowed into bone. And always the whisper, ask. It grew stronger the deeper I went, pressing against my skull like the tide. My resistance frayed with each step, my thoughts no longer entirely my own. The corridor opened suddenly into a larger chamber, one I had not seen before. Its ceiling arched high, beams fractured and blackened with age. The floor layered in dust disturbed only by my own prints. At the center stood a long wooden table, its surface scarred, its legs uneven, and around it chairs. Too many chairs. They were all occupied. Not by solid forms, but by impressions of people, outlines of presence etched into air, hazy yet unmistakable. They sat in silence, heads bowed, hands folded neatly before them, waiting as if the meal had not yet been served. My heart hammered as the torchlight flickered across their vague, faceless shapes, each one fixed in ritual stillness. The chair at the far end scraped suddenly against the floor, moving back though no one touched it. Slowly it turned toward me. A cold draft surged forward, pulling me 2 reluctant steps into the room. The whispers surged once more, unified now into a single demand that pressed against my skull. Ask. I wanted to scream, to flee, but instead my lips parted. A sound slipped out, not of my choosing, carried on a breath that did not feel like mine. What do you want from me? The seated figures lifted their heads in unison. And for the first time the house answered. The words left my mouth like a stone breaking the surface of still water. What do you want from me? The chamber shuddered in reply, the air contracting as though it had taken a long, satisfied breath. The seated figures leaned forward in eerie synchrony, and though their faces remained shapeless, I felt their attention fasten onto me, heavy and unrelenting. The torch sputtered again, its beam weak and pale, but the room no longer seemed to need light. Every detail pulsed with its own dim glow, as though the walls themselves had begun to breathe. Fine cracks along the plaster widened slightly, stretching like lips, and from them leaked a faint, muffled murmur. At first it was just noise, a broken hum, but then it sharpened into words, fragmented sentences, snatches of voices, overlapping in endless repetition. They were listening. Every sound I made, every breath, every heartbeat, the shuffle of my shoes against the warped floor, was echoed back by the house itself, distorted and drawn out, until my own life was fed back to me in mocking whispers. My name slipped through one of the cracks, spoken in a voice I recognized as my own, only lower, twisted, carrying an edge of something inhuman. I froze, my skin crawling, but the house had grown greedy. The murmurs thickened, layered upon one another until they became a constant stream, words stitched into words, rising louder with each second. They repeated questions I had never asked aloud, thoughts I had barely formed, memories long buried. Every secret I carried now belonged to the walls, and they were spilling them back, careless and cruel. I stumbled toward the table, hoping distance might lessen the effect, but the figures shifted in unison. Their hazy heads turned as one, tracking me without movement, their featureless faces reflecting something worse than eyes: intent. I pressed my palm against the nearest wall, half in desperation, half to convince myself it was still solid. The surface quivered under my touch, the plaster cold yet pulsing faintly, like skin stretched over a living thing. And then it spoke. Not in whispers this time, but in a single clear sentence, spoken in my own mother's voice. "You shouldn't have come here." I ripped my hand back as the crack beneath my palm split further, releasing a gust of stale air that reeked of damp earth. The chamber darkened, the glow from the walls faltering, and for an instant I thought the whispers had stopped. But no, they had only shifted. Now they came from inside the beams above, from beneath the floorboards, from every nail and stone. The house was no longer echoing me. It was consuming me, dragging every thought and sound into itself, learning me piece by piece. The figures around the table stirred at last. Hands, faint and insubstantial, pressed against the wood. Chairs scraped as they inched closer, their bodies leaning forward as though waiting for a command. The chair at the far end moved again, sliding closer to the head of the table. It wanted me to sit. I took a step back, but the walls exhaled sharply, a gust that pushed me forward. My legs trembled, resisting, yet with every breath the house forced out, my will weakened. The whispers united once more, not with words this time, but with a feeling that sank deep into my bones. It was hunger. The torch died completely, and in the absolute black, the table creaked as one of the chairs was pulled out. This time for me. The dark smothered everything. Not the ordinary absence of light, but a thick, pressing black that seemed to crawl across my skin, creeping into my ears and mouth until even my own breathing felt borrowed. The torch was gone, swallowed whole, its final flicker erased as if it had never existed. The only thing that remained was the sound. The endless groan of the table, the shuffling of chairs that should not move, and the whispering chorus that threaded itself around me like a noose. The seat waited, open at the head of the table, its emptiness more commanding than the faceless figures that occupied the rest. I did not sit. I could not. My legs locked in stubborn refusal, yet the house had learned how to pull without hands. A cold current wrapped around my ankles, a tide that tugged me forward inch by inch, my shoes scraping across the warped floorboards. I clenched my jaw, fighting it, but the whispers changed. No longer a swarm of broken voices. This time a single one rose above the rest, steady, deliberate, eerily calm. It was not a stranger's voice. It was my own. "Sit down." The sound chilled me deeper than the cold air, for it was not an echo. It carried intent, purpose, as though some darker version of me had been waiting here all along. My chest tightened, panic surging, but curiosity, poisonous, treacherous, threaded through it. What would happen if I obeyed? The chair creaked again, sliding closer, the wood groaning under the weight of something unseen. Then, in the silence that followed, another whisper came. Not mine, not theirs. This one was different. Softer, fragile, almost human. "Please help me." Cut through the black like a blade, trembling, desperate. My heart stumbled in my chest. The faceless figures remained motionless, their hazy outlines untouched. But the voice carried pain too raw to be illusion. It came from the far side of the table, from one of the seated shapes hunched low, its head bowed deeper than the rest. The other whispers recoiled at its intrusion, hissing in agitation, but the fragile voice pushed on, quivering as though speaking through chains. "They won't let me leave. Don't listen." The words trembled into silence, snatched away by the surrounding murmurs that rose like a storm to drown it out. The calm voice, my own voice, returned, louder now, biting, angry. "Sit down." The ground beneath me quaked, dust spilling from the rafters, the table shuddering so violently the chairs clattered against one another. The figures stirred, their hazy hands twitching on the scarred wood. The fragile voice gasped, sharp and panicked, as though struck, and then it faded into nothing. The black pressed closer, thickening until I could feel its weight on my chest. My knees buckled, forcing me to stumble forward. My palms slapped against the table, splinters biting into skin. The wood pulsed faintly under my touch, warm, alive, its rhythm syncing with my heartbeat. The whispers cheered, and then silence. The fragile voice returned once more, so faint I almost missed it, slipping between the cracks of the dark like a dying breath. If you sit, you'll never stand again. The chair behind me creaked, waiting. The fragile warning echoed inside me like a heartbeat that did not belong, faint yet unyielding. If you sit, you'll never stand again. My body trembled, caught between two hungers. My own desperate need to resist and the house's endless demand for obedience. The chair groaned behind me, its legs scraping the floor in restless anticipation, the sound more threatening than any scream. The whispers had changed. No longer chaotic, no longer scattered. They had merged into one tide of sound, low and commanding, filling every inch of the chamber. It was not merely words, but intent pressed directly against my skull. They were not asking anymore. They were offering. A bargain. The air grew colder, but in that chill was a clarity sharper than a blade. Images surged across my mind, flickers of lives that had sat at this very table before me. A woman draped in mourning black, her face hollow with grief. A man whose trembling hands reeked of guilt. A child clutching something small, a toy crushed between desperate fingers. They had all sat. They had all made their choices. The house had whispered to them too, feeding on their questions, binding them with answers. And the offer was the same now as it had been then. Sit and you will know. Sit and your pain will end. Sit, and the silence will not consume you. For a moment the temptation burned. To end the questions, to have certainty, even if it meant surrender. My throat tightened as I felt the weight of all those who had chosen before, their shadows still seated around the table, locked in eternal stillness, their bargains fulfilled in ways too dreadful to name. The fragile voice tried once more, breaking through the suffocating pressure. Weak, torn, yet urgent. Don't take it. It lies. Always lies. But the house did not falter. Instead, the whisper that wore my own voice leaned closer, speaking from just behind my ear though nothing was there. You came seeking answers. Sit and you'll have them. The truth of death, the truth of us, the truth of you. My chest ached. My breath quivered. In the black, the outlines of the faceless figures began to sharpen. Their hazy forms thickened, features struggling to form, as though my refusal was unraveling the secrecy that bound them. For the first time I could see faint traces of faces. Eyes hollow yet wide, mouths twisted as if caught mid-scream, skin stretched tight like parchment. These were the bargainers. And they were still paying. The chair behind me screeched impatiently, as if dragged forward by unseen hands. My legs trembled under the weight of the choice. To sit was to belong to them, to trade myself for forbidden truth. To resist was to endure the wrath of something that fed not just on fear, but on refusal. The table vibrated under my palms, the wood alive with heartbeat, and the house's voice surged once more, louder than all thought, tearing through me with its final offer. Give yourself, or give another. The darkness pulsed in expectation. The bargain had been revealed. The words struck like a hammer. Give yourself, or give another. The chamber fell into silence so complete I could hear the pulse in my ears, the ragged drag of my own breath. The figures around the table sat motionless, but their faces, half-formed, raw and trembling, leaned closer with anticipation. The house was not merely asking for obedience now. It was demanding sacrifice. The chair behind me pressed against the back of my legs, insistent, its wooden arms stretching as though they had grown longer, eager to enfold me. The table throbbed under my hands, warm and wet like living flesh, its heartbeat syncing with mine, tightening the noose of inevitability. I thought of the fragile voice, the one that had warned me. It had grown quiet now, perhaps silenced by the others, perhaps already lost. Yet its faint echo clung to me still, the one tether keeping me from falling into the abyss. If you sit, you'll never stand again. The bargain repeated in my skull, cruel in its simplicity. Your soul or someone else's. I stumbled backward, away from the chair, refusing the pull. The darkness did not retreat. It pressed closer, growing heavier, thick with the stench of damp soil and rotting wood. My throat burned as the whispers hissed in fury, thousands of voices screaming over one another, yet somehow unified in rage. I turned toward the door, the one I had entered through, though I could no longer see it. The black had sealed the chamber whole, walls swelling as though they had grown fat on my terror. I lunged forward, shoving blindly through the dark, but the floor warped beneath me, boards bowing upward like the ribs of a great beast. The chamber itself was alive, shifting to keep me trapped. Behind me, the chair scraped violently across the floor. It was no longer waiting, it was pursuing. The fragile voice returned in a gasp, weaker than ever. Run! I stumbled, hit the floor hard, splinters biting deep into my palms. My body screamed to rise, but the house dragged at me, its whispers battering my skull with promises, threats, and lies. See, stay, belong. No. The figures at the table shifted in unison, their hazy bodies rising at last. They loomed taller than I had imagined, their hollow eyes burning faintly in the dark. They did not step toward me, but their presence alone weighed on my chest like chains. I realized then they had not stood in years. They were bound to the table, shackled by the bargain. And if I sat, I would join them. Summoning the last shred of will, I clawed forward through the black, searching for a seam, a crack, any weakness in the suffocating dark. My fingers met plaster, the wall, but this time it was softer, yielding like damp clay. I shoved hard, the surface splitting with a groan, and a rush of cold air burst through, sharp and real. The whispers shrieked as one, a storm of rage that shook the chamber. The chair slammed against the floor behind me, the sound like bone breaking. The figures writhed at the table, their hollow mouths opening wide in silent screams. I pushed again, tearing through the wall, and stumbled into the corridor beyond. The air was foul but breathable, and the faint moonlight leaking through the cracked windows was the most precious sight I had ever known. Behind me, the chamber groaned, the wall knitting itself closed, sealing the room away as though it had never existed. The whispers faded to nothing, the silence returning heavy and absolute. I staggered down the corridor, every board groaning underfoot, every shadow shifting like it longed to keep me. I reached the front door with trembling hands, yanked it open, and was met with the chill of night air. The outside world lay before me, silent, empty, waiting. I stepped across the threshold, the cold grass beneath my feet proof that I was free. But as I turned back, the house stood tall in the moonlight, its windows black and watchful. The whispers were gone, yet the silence it radiated was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of patience. I realized then the truth of the bargain. I had not given myself. I had not given another. The house had let me go, but only because it knew one day when I least expected it, I would return. And next time it would not ask,